Chip Chapman is a retired British Army Major General. Welcome to our program, General Chip.
Good afternoon, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would like to begin with the recent statements from US President Donald Trump. Trump threatens Vladimir Putin with tougher measures, with the war getting worse if Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on a ceasefire in Ukraine. Do you feel that the tide is turning against Vladimir Putin right now with the Donald Trumps in the White House?
Well, one thing about Donald Trump is he's a sort of muscular transactionalist, and one of the difficulties at the moment, possibly with that approach, is exactly what we've seen in his approach to Greenland and possibly Canada and Panama, in that someone like Vladimir Putin could see this as an equivalence that, hey, if it's okay for you to make these threats and take things, why can't I? So, sort of policy by Twitter or by stream of consciousness is not the really real way to make policy. So I think we need to just go back to his first mentions, really, of Ukraine when he was campaigning again, really, for the second time. And that would take us back to May 23 and his notion that in terms of the war, he didn't think in terms of winning or losing. He thought in terms of stopping the killing. Now, we might term that a humanitarian peace, i.e. stop the war. And he said that again when he was in Notre Dame on the 7th of December last year. But of course, the problem with that is a ceasefire without any negotiations, or a ceasefire without Russia withdrawing to the 1991 boundaries, is it rewards the aggressor. So that's our left of arc, that he might think of a humanitarian peace, stopping the killing. And that by itself is a good thing, the basic human security need for life. The sort of middle part, I think, of the spectrum we're looking at is General Keith Kellogg's appointment as the envoy, when he, in the run-up to the Trump coming to power, sort of said that he would say something like to Zelensky, come to the table or we'll give you no support, but to Putin, come to the table or we'll give Ukraine all the support they need. And that's partly what we're talking about at the moment. Now, the problem with that at the moment is we don't really know what's on the table. What we do know from Kellogg is the one day I'm going to end the war from Putin is past, and Kellogg is certainly now looking at something like a 100 days time frame. I think that's wildly optimistic itself. But the things that they were looking at in terms of Kellogg, as part of Trump's transition team, were things like a 800-mile demilitarized zone and enforcing presence of whatever size force you want. 5 brigades of 40,000 was a discussion between Macron and the Poles, 100,000's being mentioned. I don't see how any of that is going to be acceptable to Putin, should there be any negotiations, when actually in that respect you achieve something which he's always tried to avoid, which is NATO troops on your border. And the third part of what Kellogg has said was that there should be security guarantees. I think whatever happens, that is vital for Ukraine, because one of the other notions which has been used very recently, both by the National Security Advisor, Waltz, and by Kellogg, is the notion of a sustainable peace. And that is going to be the key thing for Ukraine, not just a just peace, but also a sustainable peace. Now, the right of arc on the support which might come from Ukraine is really, for me, what came out of the Helsinki Commission in September. That is the commission in America under Joe Wilson, who's a South Carolina Republican, which looks at American-Russian relations, which sort of said, when Donald Trump understands the nature of Putin and that he is never going to negotiate in an honest sense, then he will really know the nature of the man and regime, and is likely to go to that right of the arc of Kellogg's thing, that he might support Ukraine with everything that they have. And, the leverage which Trump has is pretty significant in terms of both the volume of aid, either military, humanitarian or fiscal, his notion of ameliorating the oil prices, to also exacerbate the situation with the deep battle strikes on the oil and gas infrastructure, which Ukraine are doing very successfully at the moment. And the last part of that triumvirate would be the tightening the sanctions and possibly using the $300 billion of frozen assets. So all that looks pretty optimistic in the support for Ukraine. I think we have to be the one point of realism I'd put in here, that Peskov also recently said that the price of oil is irrelevant to the continuation of the war. And I think we always have to bear that in mind, because ultimately authoritarian leaders who have variables themselves, because Putin could get further support from Iran, North Korea or China, ultimately fight wars for political objectives. They've not really achieved any of those political objectives. And one of the reasons I think that Putin has said that he'd want a one-on-one with Trump, and therefore to exclude the agency of President Zelensky and the West, European NATO, the Bucharest Nine, however you want to frame it, is because he sees potentially that if he could play to the narcissism and ego of Trump, then he might be able to achieve more than he would in a negotiated framework in a multilateral sense.
If Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on Ukraine, do you expect big confrontation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Do you expect Trump to use all necessary means to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin?
Well, we have a pressure strategy. That is what is ongoing at the moment from Trump. What I don't see is any of this notion where people always go to this maximalist position that we're likely to have a World War III with the introduction of further weapons. I think one of the things that we've sort of seen with the demise of the Biden regime and the start of the Trump regime is actually, it seems that with the very clever attacks on the oil and gas infrastructure, that some of the sort of notions of escalation management, which Biden was always afraid of, seem to have been lifted. And for example, the attack this week on the Ryazan refinery prior to the war, that was 5% of refining capacity of Russia came from that Ryazan refinery. So the strategic targeting of the Ukrainians versus the sort of minor tactical gains, although they are tactical gains, of the Russians, seems to me to be the way to go at the moment, because the losses from a Russian perspective make no operational or strategic sense at the moment, but only an absolute autocracy could sustain that. And that is something that they may be able to sustain unless Putin and Russia goes to the notion of strategic culmination. And they might sometime during this year. It might be that the economy implodes, or the banking system under what has been mooted as the Cyprus scenario. That is that, you capitalize everyone's savings into shares, and people generally will lose 85% of their savings to keep the Russian economy afloat. And the third part of that is that the refurbishment rates of the from the Russian inventory seems to have peaked. So this is a period of a problematic period potentially for Russia. But as I said, authoritarian regimes keep going. And one of the lessons I think I learned from Prigozhin when he was knocking around Bakhmut was that he said that we might need to live like North Korea for a few years. And there's always the notion that potentially the Russian people could endure more pain to ensure that Putin remains in power and tries to achieve his objectives, his operational and strategic objectives in Ukraine, which he hasn't at the moment.
Do you think that Trump's administration is greenlighting Ukrainian strikes inside Russia right now?
Well, they've not put a red card on them, so that's the most important thing. And I think certainly from the perspective of General Kellogg, the special envoy, and as an ex-military three-star, he has a pragmatic realism in terms of the approach to how you might win a war. Now, obviously, fighting generally stops for 1, 2, or 3 reasons, either because of decisive military victory, that doesn't look on the cards at the moment, or because of the improbability of military victory. That seems more on the cards, but Putin still believes that strategic patience is on his side. Or thirdly, because of unacceptable costs, either economically, politically, militarily, or within the population. That is what Ukraine seeks to do at the moment, and actually what Putin sought to do in terms of, again, going for the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. We also need to understand why fighting doesn't stop. And one of the reasons fighting doesn't stop is because of the need for sufficient victory to justify the cost or sacrifice already incurred. So Putin will fight on in a forever war at the moment until he, one of those bits of the Clausewitzian trinity of the army walk off the battlefield as they did in 1917, or the population get fed up, or because there is elite defection. One of those three will probably pertain in the future. I'm not sure that will be 2025. I hope it is, but it's more likely that Putin is on the strategic defensive rather than Ukraine. And although there are some minor, as I said, tactical gains for Putin, as long as there is steadfast support from both Europe and America, and even if America were to withdraw that, I think the Europeans should stand up to the pitch. Then this thing has a hope, because it is Trump's number one foreign policy priority, to come to some sort of denouement, if not in 25, then sometime down the line. And the reason I'm saying not 25, but somewhere down the line, is negotiations can be very complex. And for example, it took 500 meetings and 2 years to get to the armistice in the Korean War in 1953.
Do you feel that Donald Trump has enough leverage over Vladimir Putin to force him to make serious concessions to Ukraine during the negotiations?
Well, the notion of negotiations anyway is, you have to, I think, put a slight caveat on that as well. That is a Western desire. It is not necessarily at the moment a Putin desire. So I think there'll still need to be more damage to Russia, significant damage at the strategic level to the oil and gas refineries, before you get him to a position where he would even contemplate negotiations. And for example, I think it was Lavrov who said that a ceasefire is a road to nowhere. So, they want to go somewhere, and that somewhere is still to achieve their political objectives, which are to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. That includes Ukraine, and to roll back to the pre-1997 borders in terms of NATO expansion.
So it seems like Russia will not enter negotiations, will not be ready to settle the war if not enough damage is inflicted on Russian economy, Russian army, and if Vladimir Putin faces not enough pain.
Well, that's my assessment of it, and partly the reason is so one of the leverages which Trump has said is the oil price. So try and get Saudi Arabia on side to reduce the oil price to $45 a barrel. Now, I looked this week at what the price of a barrel of oil was. It's $75 at the moment, and the price of a barrel of oil veers and haws based on geopolitical factors and other factors in the world. So, for example, just after the attack on the 7th of October in the Middle East, in the Gaza-Israel war, price of a barrel of oil was $90. Russia would suffer significantly if a barrel of oil were down to $45, but then so would Saudi Arabia, which needs a certain level of a barrel of oil to sustain its own geo-economic future in terms of its growth program to Vision 2030. So just because Donald Trump says something doesn't mean it's a policy. The price of a barrel of oil may come down, and that is a significant factor, but Putin has been very good at finding ways around the sanctions, even if they were strengthened, which is again one of the other leverage points of Trump. We know that there's this shadow fleet of 183 vessels, which is taking the oil around the sort of world on behalf. That will probably be clamped down on. So there is leverage here. you can use potentially those $300 billion in frozen assets to support Ukraine if you unlock those from those frozen assets in the West. But I don't think it's going to happen in the next 1 week or 2 weeks. And I guess that Trump's recalibration is that he would like to see the end of the war in 6 months. So you've gone from he can sort it in 1 day to now 6 months. I would be optimistic that that would be the time frame as well. I absolutely want it to be, but we shall have to wait and see, I'm afraid.
From your perspective, what should Donald Trump do in the matter of military support for Ukraine to force Vladimir Putin to negotiate a ceasefire on appropriate terms? What should be done in terms of Trump's administration, security assistance, and maybe some lifting some restrictions on American strikes on Russia with American weapons?
Yeah, I think the weapon that they'd really like, Ukraine would really like, is the Tomahawk cruise missiles, which the range is, way outside any of the range that we've seen so far, or just about. But, you have to give agency, I think, here to Ukraine. I mean, the fact that the strikes overnight of the oil installations overnight were 800 kilometers away shows that the development of both the missile and drone technology of the Ukrainians and the fact that 40% of the weapons on the battlefield are now indigenously produced by the Ukrainians shows that, we need to give agency to the Ukrainians as well. But the introduction of those weapons, American weapons with that sort of range and sophistication, the radar evading, their ability to sort of evade EW jamming and things like that, that over most weapons would devastate more parts of the oil and gas infrastructure of the Russians. And then you may get to the point when you have this sort of elite defection in Russia saying, the 3-day special military operation is turning into a 3-year nightmare. Something needs to be done to unlock this.
Let's cover also Russia's position in Syria. There have been some reports that the lease for a Tartus naval base has been reduced for Russian because new Syrian government has refused Russian army to preserve their military presence in Syria. How can you assess this big failure of Vladimir Putin there, and how can it influence Russia's position around the globe?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the fall of the Assad regime on the 8th of December coincided with Trump being in Europe when he went to the opening of Notre Dame, and when he said, come on, Assad has fallen, let's have a ceasefire and negotiations now in Ukraine. That's what he said on the 8th of December to Putin. And of course, nothing has happened since the 8th of December to make that reality. Now, the key thing about Syria from a Russian perspective was that the HTS Tahrir al-Sham, who are now de facto the Syrian government, hated Russia, saw them as enemy number one, alongside enemy number two, the Iranians, because they saw that as the Iranians is trying to impose an imperial Persian order on the Middle East. So they were never, the Russians, going to have any footprint in Syria for the future post the 8th of December. Now, my understanding is that in the last couple of days, the Syrians have actually allowed some of the ships in to start unload or loading the Russian equipment from Syria. And my estimation, along with most others, is that equipment will not go to back to Russia. It will go to Libya, because effectively Russia has lost its footprint in the Middle East, and needs to try and do something to make sure its lines of communication into Africa, where it still has significant interest, particularly in sort of Sudan, Chad, the post-Wagnerian period, that works in its favor. But was Syria a strategic setback for Russia? Yes, it was, along with it being the most significant strategic setback for Iran since 1979.
Let's cover also recent Donald Trump's statements on Greenland and Panama Canal. What is your assessment of this Trump's intention to take control over Greenland due to its importance for U.S. national security?
Well, as I said, one of the things which is the difficulty of what he said is that it gives Vladimir Putin the notion of equivalence, that you've got one leader who wants to break the UN Charter when he talks about potentially invading or using military force in another country. I mean, under the UN Charter, Article 2, brackets 4, close brackets, there are only two occasions when you're allowed to go to war. That is either when authorized by a UN Security Council resolution or in self-defense under Article 51. Neither of those would pertain in terms of Greenland. Also, it is absolutely unheard of for democracies to attack other democracies. That would be a first if it were to be done. Now, I think we need to put that aside because Trump's rhetoric is the way that Trump does business, and there's a difference between rhetoric and policy. If you then go on to the significance of Greenland and you take away from the Mercator projection of the world that we all know and love and look down from the North Pole, then you do see the significance of Greenland in terms of the Arctic ice sheets being melting away, and therefore both the trade routes and missile routes and things like that all coming into play in the 21st century. So it is absolutely correct that if you looked at from the 20th century, one of the things which is always important there was a thing called we call the GAIOC, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. That was where you needed a significant naval presence to interdict Russian submarines coming down, for example, in the Cold War. So the significance of Greenland will be amplified in the 21st century with the melting of the ice. Now, if you look at the northern tip of Greenland as well, and just go across to Canada, there's always been a Canadian base at a place called Alert, which has been part of the NORAD missile defense system. So Greenland, in terms of missile defense, early warning, all that sort of stuff for the 21st century is vital. But you don't need to start threatening a democratic ally to do that. You come up with a status of forces agreement and place your forces there as are required to make sure that you've got both sovereign security and collective security.
Also, US President Donald Trump has directed to create an iron shield, iron dome over the United States to intercept all air threats. What is your reaction to this development, and can the US government really create such an air shield to intercept all air threats, missiles which could be fired at the United States?
Well, there's no such thing as absolute security, and this is a follow-on from Ronald Reagan's Star Wars notion of the sort of early 80s. But one of the things that led to, of course, was that the Russians, for example, and probably here we're talking about the future opposition being China than the Russians. That notion of that was one of the things that probably led to the end of the Cold War, because Russia just couldn't keep up technologically and in economic terms with the power of America. That is Russia's problem today. It can't do any of those things. It is a different ballgame if the future adversary is China. And this is where you again come circularly back to Ukraine, because another of the things that Keith Kellogg has said is that the defeat of Russia would be significant in that it would take a major adversary off the table, leaving America to focus on its principal adversary for the 21st century, which is China.
And let's cover also our final topic, the situation in the Middle East and this big ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Do you expect this ceasefire to last for a long time, for a while? Do you expect this deal to survive the next months and even years?
I would doubt it. So because it was a three-phase agreement, phase one was always going to be the easiest phase, the first 42 days, the 6 weeks, when you have 33 Israeli hostages released on a basis of 1 to 30 for a Israeli civilian, 1 to 50 from an Israeli soldier. I think the problem we'll start getting at is when they start negotiating phase 2, which is day 16, and the complexities of that. So I think there'll be major bumps and hurdles into that. Do I see an enduring ceasefire? No, but there'll be something like a war between the wars where Israel will always have the notion of raiding when it needs to in the future to preserve its security. And if it thinks there's a threat from Hamas, then it will destroy them. Now, if you look at what the Israelis originally said in their 2020 war-fighting Operation for Victory doctrine, it was that Hamas were a rocket-based terror army. They're no longer rocket-based. I think that capability has been largely negated. They're probably no longer an army. Yes, we have seen lots of people parading with weapons when the hostages have been released, but that's performative politics as much as anything, not necessarily military capability. So, hope for the best. Let's hope a ceasefire endures, but plan for the worst. But what I do think is there's an opportunity, not for necessarily a two-state solution, but for further normalization in the Middle East, bringing in Saudi Arabia, etc. But for that to happen, you do need not necessarily a roadmap for peace, but a map of something which has incremental steps for the future to try and make sure that a ceasefire endures on and on and on.
Thank you, Major General Chapman, for your time and for your support for Ukraine.